Let's talk about cells and why cells are their certain size, and then in later videos we'll talk about the differences between parts of the cell. So most cells are really tiny. They're so small that you can only see them with a light microscope, and it's because of a certain reason. If they were really big, we would have issues getting waste out of the cell and good stuff into the cell. So it turns out that the larger the surface to volume ratio, the faster you can move stuff out of the cell, and the faster you can move stuff into a cell, like water and sugar and hormones that you might need. Whereas if it was really big, we'd have a problem with this. And if you remember back from that experiment we did in lab where you hit the cell with vinegar, it turned out as the vinegar sort of diffused into the cell, we found out that the small cell was able to diffuse much faster into the cell than the biggest one. It still had that bluish square inside, and it was just because it couldn't diffuse stuff in fast enough, and it couldn't diffuse stuff out like waste fast enough, and it would eventually just die. So what we say is the larger the surface to volume ratio, the better the cell. And remember, the surface area, with this test you don't have to calculate any of that stuff out, but you basically, surface area is, you just divide the surface area to volume ratio, and whichever one has the biggest, this one's 6, or this one is 3, you can see that this is going to be a more efficient cell. Size isn't everything, so we're going to actually talk about how the cell membrane works, what a ribosome is, and some genetic information. But before we even get there, let's talk about the differences between a prokaryote and a eukaryote. A prokaryote is a cell that's early. It was the first life on the planet. It has no nucleus. It's really simple. But the majority of life on this planet is mostly prokaryote, bacteria. There's two main categories. There's bacteria and archaea. You'll notice just by looking at it, it's really simple. When we see the eukaryotic cell and start to label all the parts, you'll see that it's way more complicated. So for instance, this is the cell. It's got some genetic information. It's not in a nucleus. It's just loose. These little dots all around them, those are just ribosomes. And that's really it. It's got a cell wall that's really thick and rigid, and it's just because it has no skeleton, so it needs that cell wall to give it shape. And it might have some way of moving. It's either got these long things like flagella, or it's got these little hairy thing called pili, or some way of moving. They come in different shapes, bacilli, cocci, or spirillum, this curly-shaped one. But a eukaryote is a lot different. A eukaryote has a real nucleus, and eu means true, karyon means kernel, and the kernel that they're talking about is the nucleus. There's different groups that belong to this. Protistas, which are kind of like a single-celled organism that usually lives in water, gives us stomach issues if we get it. Plants, fungus, and animals. And keep in mind, we're an animal. And fungus is definitely a multicellular organism. If you look at a fungus, it's got those sort of fins or gills on the bottom. It's got a cap. It's got an area that it attaches to the soil. So it's definitely complex. It's definitely got a true nucleus, and the nucleus is like the brain or the CPU of the cell. It basically stores the DNA, and it's directly involved in protein synthesis. The other thing that a eukaryote's going to have is all these different organelles, and the organelles will make certain things or do certain things for the cell. Kind of like we have organs, and with us we have organs because each one of our organs do a different job. So like our kidney does a job, and our liver does a job, and our kidney, did I say kidney twice? We have two, it's fine. We have organs that do different jobs. They have organelles, L's means smaller, and each of these organelles have their own job. If we look, it looks a lot more complicated. It's got all these parts. We'll talk about some of them, but you can see the nucleus, and it's got all these scrunched up little organelles, and each of them have their own job. You could tell the difference if we were to compare the two. This one is a eukaryote. This one's a prokaryote. You can get prokaryotes to live on or in the cell, where you can't do that with a eukaryote. Eukaryotes can't live on these guys. They're too tiny. We also talked about a cell membrane in the past, and a cell membrane is just stuff that keeps bad stuff out and good stuff in, and it's sort of like the wall of the cell. It allows certain things to do osmosis and diffusion based off of size and charge, but everything else kind of stays on one direction or the other direction. Let's talk about the parts of the cell in a different video.